is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, welcome to today's Hot Zone. We've got a real special guest with us today, Major General Jeffrey Schlosser. He's former commander of the 101st Airborne and spent a lot of time downrange in the war zone. And so it'll be really interesting to talk to him about his new book, Marathon War, lessons of leadership that he's put in there from Afghanistan, and his vast amount of experience in warfare in general. So General Schlosser, thank you very much for coming on with us.
And Chuck, thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
Well, let's just talk about, first of all, as if you're talking to a sixth grader, explain your experience over the last 20 years in combat. You joined the military back in the 70s, I believe.
Sure did.
So you got quite the experience of a peacetime army. And tell me how that changed as we moved into after 9/11.
Yeah, so I came in the Army as a private and ended up 34 years later as a major general. Never would have thought that would have happened, and had no intent of staying in, to be quite honest with you. But as you noted, I mean, when I came in, I went off to Germany after finally getting a commission through officer candidate school and served there in the Cold War, and then eventually went to Korea as well. And then it was right after that things started to heat up. And, your own service there in Panama, we had a number of different events that occurred after that. I was in a special ops unit, and we went to Haiti, spent a lot of time on an aircraft carrier, and then off at Cuba and Guantanamo Bay for a while. And then after that, the Balkans, Kosovo, Albania, all of those, I participated in, led troops in, led task force. But I was already by then a lieutenant colonel and a colonel. And for our listeners, that means I had about 300 initially, up to 3,000 people under my command. Eventually, of course, went off to Jordan, Kuwait, again on tours, and then eventually into Iraq. In fact, I was General Petraeus' one of his two deputies there as a deputy commander for the 101st. And finally, 15 months in Afghanistan, commanding the 101st Airborne Division in combat and NATO Regional Command East, which was the capstone. So kind of an interesting career, Cold War initially, then all these flurry of smaller wars, limited wars, limited quote unquote, as you well know, and they're never limited if you're a soldier or a Marine getting a shot coming your way, or a SEAL or anybody like that. But a pretty interesting experience overall. And I decided to write a book about it.
I just wonder about the way that leadership changed as we got into actual combat. They say that no inspection ready unit ever passed combat, and no combat ready unit ever passed inspection. So What did you learn as we got into the real deal, fighting the war against terror?
Yeah, I got recalled from Kuwait on 9/11 and got back 2 weeks later. I was in Kuwait as the military cooperation chief there as a one-star. And at the time, General Abizaid and the crew there asked me to go and start up a war on terrorism planning cell as the director. And we briefed Secretary Rumsfeld and everything. And I got the strategic view. Can be very clean if you didn't know what it was really like when you were coming up with plans that said, hey, I'm going to put a SEAL team here on this boat to stop this, or to put soldiers on Marines on the ground, or SEALs on the ground, or airmen in the air. But I had that perspective already. I'd lost some troops in a variety of different locations before that, as I've already explained. It was fascinating to see it two different ways, strategic as well as tactical. And, I used that lesson, Chuck, when I went to Afghanistan. Tried to do the same thing in Iraq, but clearly in Afghanistan, I realized on one day I would be briefing either President Bush or later Senator Obama when he came, talking to President Karzai, talking usually to the Secretary of Defense at the time, Bob Gates, and then all the ministers in Afghanistan. And at the same time, that day, I would fly out to one of my squad locations. Yes, that's about 9 to 11 people in the Army, out in the middle of nowhere. We have places with squads, 2 squads, maybe right up against the border in Pakistan. Land there, I had 2 or 3 people with me, young sergeants that were my personal security detachment. Sometimes I'd fly up with journalists, and I would spend 3 or 4 hours on the ground trying to understand what was going on. And then I'd try to get out of there before an attack could come place, because once my helicopter landed, generally the enemy knew that they wanted to come and that something important was going on. So I tried to get out of there. And then I'd go back that night, and I would have to write letters to some of the fallen that had died that day. And so it struck me that I've got in my mind, and some of it I tried to forget, strategic, talking to a president, next tactical, out with the squad, sometimes with fire coming in. And then that night, trying to deal with the losses. And again, these losses were personal to me because they were doing my orders. I was a 2-star. Yeah, that's a big, and I had 30,000 troops. But I took responsibility for every one of those orders, right? And to write a letter to that family and say, we lost your son or daughter today. And let me tell you what they were doing that was important for America. And that was tough.
Yeah, I've been on a couple of those flights. As a matter of fact, while I was embedded there with your unit, Donnie Carwile was killed in a IED attack, a lieutenant who joined on 9/11, former cop out of Louisiana. And I was on the aircraft that brought him back. And that was pretty powerful.
I can imagine.
And I remember sort of the resentment that I got just for being there from a few of the troops who were obviously very stressed out, still under fire as we were on the ground. I was trying to help them load wounded onto the aircraft with one hand and film with the other hand. And I remember the guy running up and saying, "You like to film dead people?" And I said, "Man, I'm on your side." Yeah. And I had an important job to do to let the American people know what was going on the ground. And I know that later on, but maybe a year later, I got contacted by Donnie Carwile's widow. And she asked me for the footage from that day. She wanted to see where it happened. She wanted to see what it looked like there where he died and just have that for herself for closure. I understand the difficulty of that. The thing that I think might have actually been more difficult for the troops is when they were no longer allowed to go out and close with the enemy. I mean, when I talk to the guys on the ground, they say, "This is what I signed up for." Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I'm facing my mortality on a daily basis. Yeah, I've lost friends out here. But I'm getting a very good sense of the value of the freedom that we enjoy. And there's nothing worse than taking a group of meat eaters and feeding them nothing but cabbage.
Yeah.
So talk about that. I mean, it seems like over time, the American military got more risk averse over there. I could be wrong in that. That's just my sense from, again, just skipping in and out and being on the ground. How did it look from your end?
Well, my tour there was 08 and 09, 15 months there, and we were pretty much still allowed to do the things that we needed to do. Clearly, our soldiers and Marines were out every night, every day, and doing what they were responsible, either capture, kill, give them a chance to flee, obviously working against both the terrorists, but also the Taliban, and the whole group of basically a syndicate of insurgents. I could see the handwriting on the wall, to be quite frank with you. And a part of it, I lay out in Marathon War. President Karzai was just beating me through Minister of Defense there, Wardak, to ensure that there were no civilian casualties at all. The Taliban would go out and blow up something and kill a bunch of civilians, and Karzai would say nothing. And then we would have 1 or 2 civilians killed by mistake in a air support piece, close air support or something like that, or often our special operators or even our regular soldiers would get themselves into a fight where the police didn't know that, they would be out without goggles and start a fight. And of course, the soldiers and Marines and others would end it. Anyway, we always apologize, go do the normal thing that expected in Afghanistan, but he would beat the heck out of us. And you could see that was going all the way up to the president, at the time, President Bush, and then later President Obama. And while they didn't close things down, but they were clearly putting pressure on us to be more accurate. I'll never forget Secretary Gates came on over and he wanted to go immediately over to the SOF guys, Special Operations Forces guys at Bagram. And I took him over there. And then he wanted to go see the Air Force, the A-10 squadron, and understand how precise we were targeting. And then after that, he understood if there were civilian casualties, these were really often caused by the Taliban holding up with a family and then shooting from a site or something of that nature. So I didn't see part of that. I can, and I do know exactly what you're talking about. And I don't think that when it comes time that when America decides that it's not going to send its combat trained troops into combat, then it's time to move them on out.
Well, and we need to talk about the definition of victory here. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention that so many times over the years, I've seen where the United States saw some guy digging a hole in the road and in placing an IED. And so we dropped a bomb on the guy's head. And by the time we could get out there to survey it, there are 15 or 20 piles of dirt with graves built there, and all of the local townspeople are saying, "You killed all my kids," whatever.
Yeah.
They learned that they could get money from the United States by pretending that somebody had been killed when really they hadn't. And so the vast majority of quote unquote collateral damage deaths were actually not deaths. I mean, there were so many of those. We would see them where sometimes there's 70 or 80 people. They would say, we would actually walk through the site right after they hit it and not see any bodies that weren't holding an AK-47. And by the next day, the news would come out that we killed 70 or 80 civilians in that one bomb attack, which would be just ridiculous. So the Afghans learned to play us. They learned to play the game and make it profitable for them. And I think a lot of that gets lost in translation when it gets into the media and everything. So I just wanted to put that out there. That's true.
Yeah. Well, I lived it. And I got to say that, I write about it in the book is the level of corruption I had not anticipated. Yeah. And I did not prepare myself for that or my troops for the level of corruption that we saw.
Very true. So let's talk about the definition of victory. One of the things that I remember a Canadian general telling me one time is I asked him, what does victory look like? And he said, you don't want the military telling you what victory looks like. Yeah. You want the civilians in your country to decide what victory looks like and then order us to make it happen, and we make it happen. Did you ever get given a very clear definition of what victory in Afghanistan looked like?
No. What I got was a series of strategic goals. So I went to the White House before. I went over there and spoke with some very high senior folks, not the president at the time, but I had briefed the president beforehand and in previous jobs. But I got a series of strategic goals, pretty much what you would expect, right? But they had morphed from 2001 to basically capturing, killing Al-Qaeda, and then pushing the Taliban out of the country. So that's what the baseline was in 2001, in October of 2001. My goals were those, plus make Afghanistan so it will no longer become a safe haven, which meant economic, political development, as well as providing security. And there was this tension there. And Chuck, I got to be honest with you, at the time, I thought it was doable. I thought that we had a chance of doing it. Our prep for this was in 2006 and 2007. I had plenty of time to prepare for it. And I really thought, I can understand the concept that, if there's nothing there, the place will be back to being a safe haven right away, because the Afghans did not have a viable economy other than based on poppy and corruption. The political system had never, as you saw there, was never really entwined between the locals and the tribal leaders all the way up to a central government. It just didn't work very well that way and had never been part of their culture or their political system. And so we could provide limited security throughout the country in places because frankly, if you look at a counterinsurgency, we never had enough troops to totally dominate an entire country, not like we did in post World War II, or what we did for a period of time in South Korea and Korea. We were making the best we could possibly do with the set of what I would say goals that sounded right. They sounded like it made sense, but it's one of those things where if you looked at the history of Afghanistan, it was probably way too much to expect a military of any type, of any capability to actually do.
I don't know that anybody ever expected Afghanistan to become a Jeffersonian democracy, but I think what surprised everybody was how backward they could actually be. You take a culture that's been around for 6,000 years and hasn't figured out flush toilets yet, or paved roads, or light switches, or beds, and you give them flush toilets and light switches and paved roads and beds. That's not necessarily going to change their mindset. It's not necessarily going to change their way of thinking. And
let me follow up on that, Chuck, for a sec.
Yes, sir.
Because, you mentioned how ancient the society is, and in fact, it is. What I would say to add on to what you've just said is, since 323 BC, when Alexander the Great established a base, and his base was at Bagram, by the way, and then invaded north and then invaded east. And then after that, past that invasion, Genghis Khan basically just rolled up the skulls of much of the Afghan people. And then later, Tamerlane. It goes on and on and on, right? The Brits, the Soviets, and then the US. By that time, if you've got 12 invasions over the history of your country, you regard anybody as an invader, even if you're we thought we were doing good things for the country, right? We're bringing schools, we're bringing medical care, we're bringing some limited security to your village. They potentially saw us as invaders no matter what. And I don't think we ever really understood that for a very long time.
And they've got a pretty good history of using the things that the United States does for them for things that we are not happy with. Those sort of fungible things that we provide to Afghanistan and durable things that we provide to Afghanistan, like microhydroelectric or, for example, the canals that we dug in the southern parts of Afghanistan. USAID built those canals back in the 40s and 50s, and then they were being used in the 90s and 2000s for growing poppies. That's not really what we had in mind, when we built those.
Absolutely.
It's a very different culture, and that cultural piece is something that we kind of didn't take into account so much, or maybe couldn't have, because you're always going to see things through the lens of your own culture and upbringing. And as we say, that the generals are always fighting the last war, not the next one.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media.
Copyright 2021.